Welcome to Nightmares and Grief, a place to explore and celebrate the darkness. Each episode, I'll read stories written by me, Derek Heisey. Today's episode is part 2 of my novel, To Make the World Obey. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I strongly recommend you start there. I've left a link in the description. Now, settle in, check under the bed, and pour a drink for the skeletons in your closet. It's time to start.
Deborah, December 6th, 2024. The scene was grisly, and Deborah was certain she was dreaming. It was like nothing she'd seen before. Not here. Not at home. None of it made sense. She dodged a pair of EMTs rushing a cart out of the supermarket door. A woman with a bloody stump where her right arm used to be screamed and wailed. Deep red mouths sliced across her torso. The smell of blood tainted Deborah's nose. She built her defenses, raised the drawbridges, sealed herself up. A small army of officers had been called to investigate the scene and manage the confusion. Deborah walked through them in a daze. Memories of little Afghan villages pushed their way through to the surface of her mind. With the exception of setting, the scenes were identical. But this was a Fred Meyer on the West Coast. That upset everything. The scent of cigarette smoke calmed her. Freddie had needed a moment when he first saw the scene and had been standing outside the supermarket preparing himself. Deborah knew it was too much for him. The same images replayed in his mind, too. He didn't steel himself against them as well as Deborah did. In the lines of his face, she read silent screams scrawled in logographs that only they and those like them could understand. Freddie hadn't built his fortresses as strongly, and now he had been pushed to the edge of a very dark place. She put a hand on his shoulder. Freddie flinched. Deborah squeezed. Some of the tension left him. "You doing okay?" she asked. Freddie closed his eyes and clenched his jaw. "Yeah, Deb. Doing okay." She rubbed his shoulder and offered a little smile. "Let's go find some clues, Fred." "Right on, Scoob." The two took a deep breath together and plunged back into the grocery store. 2 different kinds of weapons were used, blades and firearms. The bargain bins full of reduced-priced hamburger helper were powdered with the dust of decimated seasoning packets. Deborah's boots crunched over the exploded bits of noodles and rice. Blood and tomato juice mingled on the floor of the produce section. Deborah focused on the cigarette smoke clinging to Freddie's jacket. One of her fortresses was built from his smoke. An entire section of meat had been taken from the refrigerated troughs. "One of the cashiers said they didn't take any cash," Deborah remarked. Freddie knelt down. "What did the manager say?" He scooped up a bullet casing with his pen, then dropped it into a Ziploc evidence bag. Deborah watched him. "The manager was beheaded," she said. Freddie's head hung loose from his shoulders and he was slow to get to his feet. She continued, "There was one survivor that we've been able to talk to, a high schooler that hid in the bathroom for most of it. I'm pretty sure she'd be in the same state as the rest if she hadn't stayed in there when she heard the gunfire." Freddie grimaced. They walked past aisle after aisle, bursting with camera flash explosions. On the floor in front of the tricks and Lucky Charms had been taped a very small outline. Deborah looked away and kept talking. 4 men. All of them had beards, 3 of them white, 1 possibly Hispanic. She didn't get a great look at any of them. What she does have is unreliable. Listening to facts kept her grounded. This is what we know. This is what we don't know. These are things we need to focus on. By keeping grounded, she could keep her distance. Facts were one of her fortresses, too. All of them were big, she said, like bodybuilders. They were wearing armor. Freddy's face shriveled. Armor? Leather gear, motorcycle helmets. The one with the sword also carried a shield. Freddy scoffed. Was it a trash can lid? It's possible. They were almost to the dairy section when Freddy halted in his tracks. Cameras, he said. What about the cameras? You think they might have picked up something? Freddy dropped his gaze and shook his head. I don't know. If they were wearing helmets, it'd be hard to make anything out, but it's worth a shot. He stopped a patrolman walking by and handed him the evidence bag with the bullet casing. Get this dusted for prints, he gestured broadly. Get them all dusted for prints. The patrolman nodded, and then he was off. Freddy shoved his hands into his pockets and heaved an enormous sigh. His shoulders sagged. It's gonna happen again, isn't it? Deborah grit her teeth. Yeah, it is.
Vicky, December 7th, 2024.
Heather put the rolled dollar bill into her nose and leaned over the mirror. While she was normally the spitting image of delicacy, when it came to coke, she was a greedy little fiend. The sound Heather made came from deep in her sinuses, like a little boy with a bad cold clearing out his nose. It was loud and throaty, and though Vicky had never seen one, she imagined it was the kind of sound a rhinoceros would make. She made a mental note to look up YouTube videos with Felix later. I haven't seen Esmeralda today, she remarked. The statement wasn't necessarily directed at Heather. It was launched into the room like a shout into the void. Heather just happened to be the only one there. I bet she's just sick, Heather replied, brushing up the remaining powder with her middle finger and rubbing it around her gums. Waste not, want not. Although nobody had said anything about Esmeralda, Vicky didn't find Heather's comment strange. Disappearing was a common part of the job, at least with Cosmo and the friends. Esmeralda had been very close to one of the crow-faced old-timers who sipped gin and tonics like a baby sucks at the tit. Getting close was one of the greatest occupational hazards. High risk, high reward. Girls disappeared that way. Heather's flippant excuse was likely a shield she'd put up around herself. Girls recovered from being sick. They didn't recover from disappearing. Cosmo burst into the room, scowling like a thunderhead. Show starts in 10, girls. I want to see them titties bounce like tight rubber balls the moment you get out. Yes, Cosmo, Heather said. She cast him a smile and his face softened. He patted her cheek and then the smile fell away, returning to its natural furrow. He scanned the girls in the room as he took attendance. A confused expression knotted the lines of his face, and he raised a finger as if to indicate he wanted to speak. Now, just hold on one fucking minute. Where the fuck is Esmeralda? And where the fuck is Jackie? Vicky looked around the dressing room. He was right. She hadn't noticed just how short they were on girls tonight. At the last vanity along the row, Lola said, My cousin heard Jackie was sick. She didn't look away from the mirror. She applied her eyeliner, a bold turquoise that flared out in a strong cat's eye, with such a determined surgical intensity that Vicky doubted she could look away even if she wanted to. Cosmo turned his head to Lola while the rest of him remained fixed in place as if hewn from marble. His fingers, poised at the center of his torso, froze in mid-fidget. Above his broad shoulders, Cosmo's head bobbed and a sardonic snarl crept along his lips. You stop and think at some point that might be something you ought to tell me? Lola didn't answer right away, focused as she was on her makeup. Vicky shivered. Brushes and perfume bottles and tweezers hushed to stillness. Lola finished her eyes and got to work on her eyebrows. "What?" she asked, still not casting her gaze to Cosmo. "I'm not her boss. I figured she'd call in or whatever." Vicky knew that Lola knew that you didn't just call in. Cosmo flicked his head and sucked on his cheek. "What else your cousins say, huh? Since when the fuck do you have a cousin who fucking knows Jackie anyway?" He slammed a fist against Esmeralda's vanity. Cosmetics leapt into the air. A perfume bottle rolled off and shattered on the floor, sending a noxious cloud of body fantasies vanilla to fill the tiny space. "Lord Christ, Lola, if I wasn't already short on girls." His hand balled into a swaying fist, and he let the sentence drift away, but its unspoken promise lingered in the air almost as pungently as body fantasies. "And where the fuck is fucking Molly?" Vicky wedged into the tension. "Who's going on instead of her?" she asked. She didn't turn to give Cosmo a smile, choosing instead to meet his gaze through the mirror. They had a different kind of relationship. The lines of Cosmo's glare softened and the hardness of his eyes shifted to an almost imperceptible glimmer. He cocked his head toward her like a curious chicken. "Oh, you want an extra dance?" It took a lot of effort for Vicky not to let her eyes light up, but she managed. She'd learned how to kill her enthusiasm. "Sure," she said. "Then earn it. We'll do you, then Heather, then Candy, then Lola, then you again." Cosmo sighed and growled again, wiping his face. "And Candy and Heather can fight over who takes Jackie's spot." He oscillated his hands before his chest. "I better see them titties bounce!" He vanished through the curtain as quickly as he'd come. Vicky looked through the mirror and let herself smile now. It was a good reward. The night started well. Vicky went out to This Is the New Shit and made sure she was a tough act to follow. Heather came out to a warmed-up crowd and did her thing, and she was good, but she wasn't as good as Vicky. Her choice of song, Hotel Room Service, didn't work for her. She didn't have the strength Vicky did. She couldn't twirl herself as viciously, couldn't project herself as powerfully, couldn't lose herself as completely. She didn't have a dizzy to fall back on. Between sets, Vicky told Xavier she wanted him to play closer for her second dance. He raised his eyebrows and made a comment about her choice in weird old tunes and something low about white people, but he'd worked with her long enough to trust her taste. Xavier understood that Vicky knew the depths of her capabilities and recognized her market. Vicky never got to dance to it. The violence started when Candy, a thin, nearly retired nobody with blue hair, was halfway through her dance. Candy didn't stop dancing. Watching from backstage, Vicky felt the confusion more than she saw or heard it. She searched the crowd for the source. Nobody else noticed. The boys were all looking at their drinks, or looking at the girls, or looking at Candy. Vicky knew the flow of things, and something was wrong. Nobody looked at the entrance, where 3 men stood over the headless body of the backup bouncer, Mike. The men brandished guns and wore helmets. Another man emerged from them, dressed in what Vicky could only assume was homemade armor. He brandished a shield in one hand and a sword in the other. The sword was already dark with blood when he sliced through another unsuspecting man. The music wasn't loud enough to stifle the screams of the 3rd and 4th victim. That was when everyone else noticed the men, too. The gunfire countered the rhythm of Rammstein's cover of Stripped with jarring irregularity. The guns flashed like inconsistent strobe lights. Men threw girls off their laps and clambered over tables looking for an exit, but there was only one exit, and the men had blocked it. The man with the sword and shield was big, and his ridiculous anachronism would have been hilarious if the slaughter he brought down wasn't so horrifying. He tore through flesh with the long steel blade, carving out a nonsense path before him. He swung with purpose, but moved with chaos, here for no other goal, it seemed, than bedlam. The men were here for blood, and blood alone. Vicky cowered behind the bar and covered her ears. Just a few minutes before, she'd been trying to sell a dance to a man with a newsie covering his bald spot. His sweat managed to pour through the cologne, even though he doused himself in it like he was Thich Quang Duc on the day of his immolation. That man was dead now. Dead and bleeding on the linoleum, his legs splayed out and his arms cast to the side like a broken toy. Copper-scented chaos saturated the club. After what seemed like hours, but was truly only a scattering of minutes, the growing quiet of the dead calmed rolling hills down. The opening bars to Closer began. A presence loomed above Vicky. The man with the sword and the shield stood above her, looking down. Shadows covered his face, but his eyes gleamed through the darkness. His armor was wet and shiny. His whole body was wet. Xavier was dead, slumped over his booth, but the music still played, and when the man in the armor moved his mouth, Vicky couldn't make out the words. Two of the men with guns appeared, and they clamped their hands around her so tight it hurt. She thought she screamed as they dragged her away, but Vicky wasn't sure. She couldn't hear herself until she was in the parking lot, and then her screams were all that she could hear. Above her stretched the washed-out, muddy blackness of the city's night sky, and during a moment of lucidity, she felt the shocking cold of the snow against her bare legs and the dull teeth of asphalt drag across the back of her thighs. Two of the men exchanged words, but Vicky could only make out that there was supposed to be another one. They flung Vicky through the wide open doors of a big van, and when they slammed shut, she threw herself against them, not thinking now, returned as she was to primitive instincts of fear and survival. A wet cloth clamped onto her mouth, and her nostrils were overcome with a distantly antiseptic smell, and before the world was devoured by hollow sleep, she saw Lola laying limply beside Heather, whose hands covered her mouth as mascara ran over her face and fingers. Vicky fell into the darkness with a lullaby of Heather's weeping. Temujin, December 7th, 2024. The men sat on the floor of the big black Beauville, resting their feet on the bodies of the unconscious women they had bound and collected from the strip club. There were 3. There were supposed to be 4. The discrepancy had not gone unnoticed. Temujin sprawled on the floor where the front passenger seat used to be, his enormous torso propped up by his elbows.
"I wonder where the other woman is," he murmured.
He didn't look at Bartu as he spoke, but he didn't need to. Bartu had been there since the beginning. He and Temujin understood each other through a primal skein which bound them beyond brotherhood. It was because of this bond that Temujin now felt so betrayed. Something was wrong with Bartu. They were supposed to have taken 4 women for the collection. This failure brought shame, The clan had eluded capture and grown to its present maturity because there were rules that all the men followed. Temujin sensed a restlessness in Bartu that could not be tolerated. He detected a seed of dissent. Bartu didn't have a reply for Temujin's question, and Temujin hadn't expected one. The patriarch noticed his brother's fingers tightening around the steering wheel, his hands twisting it with minute back and forth motions. If Temujin hadn't been looking for them, if he hadn't been looking for something, anything to disprove his suspicions, then he would have missed it. But he found it. He saw Bartu's little tells, and it broke his heart. In the back of the van, the men spoke to one another with cheerful words and proud voices, and Temujin wanted to be part of that victory, but there were only 3 women in the back of the van when there should have been 4, and Bartu was unaccounted for the night that Sukhothai received his name. It would be a perilous task, killing Bartu, but it was a necessary one. He spent the rest of the night in silence.
Deborah, December 7th, 2024.
Commissioner Hartigan was a Krautmet cop in a long line of Irish cops. His blood ran blue. He was a teetotaler and a bodybuilder, and he wasn't afraid to beat corruption into submission within the confines of the law. Earl Hartigan was frightening at times, and his gruff glare made Deborah feel small, but they respected each other, and Deborah knew that she had nothing to fear today. Hartigan leaned over his folded hands on the desk and toyed with the toothpick sticking out of the side of his mouth.
"How's the dumpster murder coming?"
he asked. Deborah had declined to sit, standing instead as she had in front of her commanders in Afghanistan. She suspected that was one of the reasons Hartigan liked her. "It's coming as well as we could expect, sir, given the rash of incidents over the past few days." The attack on the Fred Meyer and the strip club were connected. Same MO, same description of the perps. Nobody had any doubts about that. But Deborah thought Lucinda's case was connected too. "Nothing solid yet, but we have the victim's alias and we're running the body in the bags for whatever prints may be left. We have a lead on her pimp, which Freddie and I will follow up on tonight." But it's not important, she thought. There's a bigger picture here. Hartigan bobbed his enormous head up and down. Dumpster bodies were hard. It was difficult to determine what was and wasn't part of the actual crime scene. The muscles below his jaw tightened as they did before he spoke, but he faltered. The commissioner seemed to recognize Deborah's hesitation.
"Speak your mind, Detective Samson."
Deborah took a deep breath and girded herself. "I want to be put on the Fred Meyer case, sir." Now it was Hartigan's turn to hesitate. He kept his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and the tendons in his forearms rose and fell.
"You already have a case," he said. "And we already have a detective on this one. Anyway, I can tell you the FBI is going to poach it sooner than we can do anything about it."
"What's the Bureau's interest, sir?" Hartigan shrugged and frowned, leaning back into his chair and lacing his fingers behind his head. Deborah knew it was a stupid question. She was hoping she'd get a smart answer.
"I'm sure you know. Everyone's been talking about it. The Fred Meyer case is clearly connected to the attack on Rolling Hills. I also have a few friends further south, and it seems awfully similar to a series of incidents that have been running their way up here. It makes it interstate crime and domestic terrorism. I'm surprised Homeland Security isn't jumping on it."
Stoic as a statue, frozen in her at-ease stance, Deborah let a controlled sigh through her nose. "Put me on the case, sir. Let me work until the Bureau gets here, and then I can work as a liaison." Hartigan studied her. He'd seen a lot of faces, Deborah knew. He'd worked here in this city, in this department, his whole life. Policy had changed, and people had left or died, but Earl Hartigan remained a fixture among all the change, like a weathered stone monument in the sand. He must know many cops, and he must be literate in the patterns written in the lines around the mouth, eyes, and foreheads, able to read them as easily as parents read Hello Moon to their babies. Deborah watched him back and wondered what he read in her face.
"What's this thing to you?"
he asked. His voice softened. It still rumbled with the harsh growls of a quarry, but Deborah heard lullabies in the softness of those 5 words. It was a chance. She raised the angles of her chin and squared her shoulders further. I think it's connected to Lucinda's case. The dumpster murder. Same victim type, same kind of brutality. I think it's the same case. Hartigan shrugged.
"Then you're already on the case. Follow the dumpster leads and they'll bring you to the Fred Meyer case. Why do you want to be on it officially?"
I want access to the information that case has.
"You're a good cop. If these 2 cases are connected, you'll find the information in your own way, and the case will be even stronger."
Hartigan leaned forward and onto the desk.
"I see no reason to put you on the case."
Deborah's shoulders tightened. Time for the Hail Mary. It's a matter of personal interest, sir. It reminds me of things I've seen. Hartigan didn't move for a while. Deborah caught herself holding her breath.
"That's 2 of the best reasons I've heard to pull a cop off a case, Detective."
They stared each other down until Deborah averted her eyes in defeat. The room was silent while Hartigan studied her.
"You really want this case, don't you?"
he asked. Yes, sir.
"Why?"
Deborah raised her eyes again. May I speak freely, sir? Hartigan shrugged.
"Yeah, sure, go ahead."
It's fucked, sir. Seeing something like that here when it should be there. It's fucked. While I can't speak for him, I'm certain Detective Plum feels the same way. Respectfully, the commissioner allowed a time of silence to pass. Then he asked softly,
"How long were you 2 over there, Samson?"
3 tours, sir.
"Did you have to?"
Unintentionally, Deborah found herself shifting her weight between feet. That's a complicated answer, sir. Hartigan offered a knowing grimace. He seemed to understand. In that grimace, Deborah recognized that while her fortresses were of the mind, his were built of muscle. He said,
"Detective Samson, I can't give you this case. I need you to figure out about that poor girl they found in the dumpster. This supermarket thing is big and sexy, and a lot of resources are going into it. There's going to be too many dead girls falling through the cracks as it is. I need you to make sure this one gets redeemed."
Samson nodded, and Hartigan dismissed her. She left the room disappointed, but strangely comforted. If she were ever found eviscerated in a dumpster, no matter what other flashy cases might come along, Commissioner Hartigan would make sure that she was taken care of. It was a strange comfort in a tiny, ugly world.
Vicky. In the darkness.
The first sense that woke with Vicky was touch. The surface she lay on was hard and cold. The air closed in around her, dense with a wet stink. It was dark. The darkness extended beyond the lack of light. The feel of things was dark. The smell of the place was dark. An indefinite quality hung around Vicky, a veritable sensation of darkness. She shivered, and a bead of sweat trickled between her breasts. She was naked. The little epiphany set her into a panic, and all of her senses were drowned out in the thoughts that followed. Why am I naked? Where am I? I'm naked in the dark, and I don't remember how I got here. What the fuck? The last thought replayed over and over again in her head, repeating louder and louder until it was an overwhelming siren. She reached about her for nothing in particular, searching for anything that might give her some sense of place. The disorientation was too much. When her hands reached metal, wiry bars, the memory of the night before invaded her thoughts like the slow-moving head of a python. Vicky remembered the smell of chloroform as vividly as if she were being drugged again, and it mingled with the gunpowder and the blood. Nausea rolled over her in a wave. On all fours, Vicky's whole body reacted, heaving up what little she had in her stomach. Muffled by the walls and distance, a door creaked open. Quiet voices conspired nearby. Women's voices. Vicky wiped off her mouth with a slash of her hand. "Help!" she screamed. "Help me!" As if in response, there came a muted groaning of stairs, and the voices of the women died like tired embers. Vicky's gut sank into her bowels. It was not a savior descending the steps. Amid the quieting feminine voices came the low rumble of a man's. It was too soft for Vicky to make out any of the words, but it seemed to silence the others. A door very close to Vicky unlocked and opened. Naked feet on concrete or tile, she couldn't tell which. Then there was light, square and tall, that crawled across the floor and painted Vicky, bathed her, and framed inside the light there stood a figure. "You've messed in your pan," thundered. Vicky glanced at the puddle of vomit, illuminated by the sickly sallow beam, and the yellow pool made her ashamed. She should be too angry to be ashamed, or too frightened, and she couldn't decide which reaction was more appropriate, but she wasn't, which confused and embarrassed her. The figure said, "You're disgusting." Vicky scampered backwards into the farthest corner of her pen and eyed the figure behind her hands. She folded her thighs up to her chest and closed into herself, peering over the lean, knobby peaks of her knees. The figure cut through the narrow rectangle of weak light with his broad shadow, leaning down and unlocking the heavy chain around the door of the wire cage. She thought to escape, to scamper out. But her stomach twisted, and she felt scared, and that made her feel even more ashamed. He reached for her with his wide, hairy hand, and she opened her mouth to scream, but his hand was so big, and it clamped down over her whole mouth. It was like screaming into the void. The fingers tightened around her cheeks, and the figure dragged her by the hair. Her naked body ground against rough concrete. It bit into her calves and heels, scraping them. Vicky writhed in his grip, twisting one way and then the other, pulling and pushing to gain some sort of leverage. Her hands swung in fast, vicious arcs, striking at him with Wolverine violence. She drew blood a few times. She could feel it. She could taste it. If it bothered him, he didn't show it. The whole time she heard shifting. When they got out of the room, he transitioned his grip. He released her mouth and wrapped as much of her hair as he could around his hand. He grasped both ankles with his free hand. He slung Vicky across his shoulders like a sack. She was repulsed by the warm, moist skin that pressed against her back. His muscles undulated beneath her with the tide of his movements, and that repulsed her too. He carried her through a drab, concrete hallway, neither white nor gray nor black, but a bland complexion combining all three and seemingly none at all. Vicky screamed and heard other voices on either side of her, muffled behind walls, as they shouted back. The hallway was short, but the journey to the door may as well have taken an eon. Vicky's throat was already raw. On the other side of this door was a wide open space. This was where the murmuring had come from. Vicky heard it now, but with the arrival of the man carrying her, silence once again rippled across the room. Vicky couldn't see the space well, only the ceiling with the way he carried her, but with what she could discern from the glimpses she caught, the room was sparsely populated with dog cages. She screamed for help again, and there only came taut silence in response, along with the palpable sense of eyes following her. Tension manifested physically in the space around her like a fog suspended in the cold, damp air. The sensation of being watched did not last long. Soon, they passed through another door, and when it groaned shut, Vicky sensed the isolation again. The room was dark, and once more she continued her struggle, scratching and writhing and flailing and screaming, but the man threw her off of him as if it were a matter of course. A switch by the door snapped on, and the light flooding the room lacked all conviction, as if it were also a tired prisoner of this bland concrete tomb. Vicky earned a few more pink scrapes when she tumbled over the floor. She rolled onto her hands and knees, and with a nightmarish roar pulled from a deep, primal place in her gut, Vicky's legs tensed and she launched at her abductor. Hands caught her mid-leap. The trajectory of her momentum reversed as the strong fingers pulled her away from the man who brought her here. The cold floor greeted her again. In her bewildered rage, Vicky had neglected to notice the second man in the room. How many were there? The thought drifted across her mind like a small cloud in a big sky. She stared at the ceiling again, dazed, bewildered, panicked. Both men appeared swiftly, like manifesting ghouls. Both of them were big. Christ, thought Vicky. I've never seen so many meatheads in my whole life. One of them, Vicky couldn't tell if it was the one who carried her or the one who'd caught her, lifted her off the floor while the other one bound her hands behind her back with duct tape. They carried her to a chair. Her vision refocused and the images swimming before her started to make sense. Was that a metal rolling table in the corner? What were the things on it? The men bound her to the chair with more duct tape. The weight of the situation sank in. She was so good at detaching herself from the ugliness of life that she hadn't really processed what was happening to her, and a blind, hateful fire erupted in her gut. Dizzy emerged. She thrashed about, feral and vicious, lobbing curses and violent promises that would have had patrons at Rolling Hills cowering, running home to post about the psycho stripper on Facebook, but it was too late. One of the men held her head back by the throat while the other brandished a set of electric clippers. They buzzed like swarming locusts in Dizzy's ear. The metal teeth raked across her scalp and made her shudder. Fat, black locks plummeted from her head to the floor. Dizzy screamed and raged and bucked in the chair against her bonds. When she sucked in air, she inhaled strands of hair. They made her cough and choke. The men continued their work calmly. They ignored the foul words spewing from her mouth and gave no heed to the hollow threats. They held her down and cut her hair, and then they beat her. The men beat her with flexible sticks, and though Vicky asked, they gave no explanation. They spoke only in the percussive language of violence. When they finished, they tore off the sticky duct tape around her breasts, shoulders, and belly. It burned her skin, but Vicky had only a shell of consciousness by then, and the hateful fire in her gut was not enough to sustain it. There were other voices, and then hands pushed Vicky off the chair. She crumpled to the floor, and it was so cold that it was a blessing. The door squeaked as they shut it, and Vicky was submerged again in sacred darkness. The fire in her gut burned out into gray embers. She wasn't sure if she cried until sleep took her, but Vicky thought later that she probably did. Without landmarks or routine, she lived only in two states: merciful sleep and the beating. The beatings seemed to come at random. Vicky could not identify a pattern. She was almost certain that there was more than one man, but they blurred together into an archetype. They were all the same man, armed with the same stick. In the beginning, they didn't say anything to her. But when she resigned herself to the violence and stopped screaming, they spoke. She was worthless, they said. She was weak. She couldn't protect herself, and that was why they could take her. That was why she was a whore. Vicky wasn't a whore. There were girls working at the club that did work for Cosmo like that, but she wasn't one of them. They kept saying it, though, and they kept beating her for it, and so she believed it. Why else would they keep hitting her? She must have earned it by doing something wrong. They gave her water, and it made her crazy. When she drank it, she saw visions in the dark. Some of them had form, but most of them were simply terrifying color. The color followed her into sleep and leaked into her nightmares, so she stopped drinking the water. Sometimes they forced her to drink it when they beat her, and then they would ask for her name. No matter what she answered, they told her it was wrong, and they hit her harder. Hunger made her stomach ache, made her too weak to think straight. Once she woke to the sound of a struggle. The door burst open and the men threw a woman beside her. A bulb in the ceiling flooded the room with light. The woman was Lola. Vicky screeched with relief and scrambled across the floor to her. She wrapped her arms around Lola and squeezed her trembling naked body as tight as she could. She said her name over and over again, Lola, 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 and rocked back and forth. Lola's eyes were glassy and dazed, as if they were looking at something far away, and then they flickered back and forth over everything around her until at last they seemed to catch Vicky. Lola's mouth flapped open and closed a few times, and then, with what appeared to be a monumental force, she stammered, Vicky? The name didn't seem right. It didn't seem to fit. It confused her. She didn't have enough time to reconcile the confusion. One of the men stomped in and peeled Lola out of Vicky's arms. Lola erupted into short, panicked shrieks like a small, terrified bird, and then there was a gunshot. The room was small, so the gunshot was deafening. Sustained, high-pitched ringing whined through Vicky's ears. The pain cracked her skull wide. She held the sides of her face and slumped to the floor. She was glad it was cold. The man walked out of the room. Vicky looked for something in Lola's dead eyes until the door slammed shut and the lights went out. The blood coating the floor was warm.
Deborah, December 7th, 2024. Once they were outside the building, Freddie asked, "How'd I go with Hardigan?" Deborah sighed. "Not great." Freddie chewed his cheek. "That's no good. We've only been on the case a few days." Without answering or acknowledging him, Deborah unlocked the olds and got inside. She didn't speak until Freddie closed the door. "I asked for us to be put on the Fred Meyer case." Freddie stiffened. "What?" Deborah kept her gaze staunchly forward. "You don't want to catch those bastards?" Well, Freddie stammered back. I want them to be caught, but Deb..." He shifted in his seat to face her. "That's dangerous stuff. Like, real dangerous stuff." He gesticulated as he continued. I don't know about you, but I joined the police after service, so I only had to be involved in dangerous stuff, not real dangerous stuff." Deborah sighed and her eyes hardened. She felt betrayed. "Well, it doesn't matter. He didn't put us on the case anyway." "Good. Fuck that. I don't want to have any part of that, not now. That's A-grade crazy shit, like a horror movie, like Red fucking Dragon." "Red Dragon?" The first Hannibal Lecter book. It's scarier." Deborah glanced at him. "Maybe, but you're not a woman." That was that then. Freddie didn't have her back on the Fred Meyer case. She knew that finding Lucinda's killer was important, but especially if they were related, it was just a piece of the puzzle. She wondered how Freddie would react when they discovered that. Deborah started the olds and went to Peaches. Frank Peaches Augustine was a young pimp who learned from the old school, hated women, and loved whores. Towards the end, before she was shot, Deborah's sister ran with Peaches, and bitterly, the two formed a professional working relationship. She looked the other way, and sometimes got his girls off the hook, and he passed her information from time to time. Deborah hated it, but it was functional. She did what she had to do. But Peaches never gave information unless it was beneficial for him. This was their only lead, and Deborah refused to let it slip through her fingers. He might need to be leaned on, and that professional relationship might need to break. Before she got out of the car, Deborah checked her gun. The neighborhood was familiar. She knew people here. Memories, somber phone call, pulling the olds to a rundown tenement, and more tried to push their way to the front of her mind, but Deborah caught them, broke them, and sent them back to the dungeon of her mental fortress where she'd locked them in the first place. Freddie pulled his coat close to him and cast a shifty glance up and down the street. That wary glint in his eyes always came from sizing a place up. This was the kind of neighborhood where the snow on the sidewalk was always slush, and the piles that lined the street were sad gray mounds. Someone was always playing Biggie or Tupac down the street from you, and you had to watch what you said or say nothing at all. Deborah and Freddie weren't welcome here. Very few people were who weren't already there. If you weren't known, what business could you possibly have? What good could you possibly do? Freddie kept close to Deborah and licked his lips. "What's the big plan?" Deborah kept a steely gaze fixed on the rundown tenement before them. In a dry, flat voice, she said, "We're going to go to Peaches and ask him politely who Lucinda is." Freddie's eyes lingered on her as if he were waiting for her to continue. She didn't. "What if he doesn't tell us?" Deborah sighed. "In that case, we walked softly and it didn't work." She patted the Glock under her coat. "That's why I also carry a big stick." Freddie grimaced, but he didn't comment. When they got to the tenement, Deborah knew they'd been made.
It wasn't hard, after all. The small-time hustlers leered at them, daring the detectives to make eye contact, and the junkies writhed like pill bugs under an overturned rock. Susanna lay in the concrete on the front stoop, blood pooling beneath her face. Deborah looked away from them and focused on the cold which stung her ears. She reached up and touched the lotus studs that used to be her sister's. No one stopped them when they entered the building, although a couple of professional hoods stood outside the door. They kept eyes on the detectives as they went up the stairs until they passed the second landing and were out of sight. "It's just as cold here as it is out there," Freddie grumbled. "It's too expensive to heat the whole building, and it keeps the squatters out." Peaches was on the top floor and had no doubt been alerted to their presence. Two big men, pointedly dressed in tank tops despite the weather, barred the way to the landing. Freddie faltered, but Deborah didn't stop on the steps with him. She made as if to will them to separate and open the way. One of them shook his head. He had the wide nostrils and furrowed brow of a gorilla.
"I know you're not coming here to talk to nobody."
His voice was clear and strong, like the sound of falling boulders. "Peaches owes me a favor," Deborah replied. She didn't hesitate, and though she'd avoided eye contact since they got to the neighborhood, her eyes locked with his. The big goon didn't scare her. His friend did. The friend's nose was long and his eyes were dead, and he reminded her of a python, like Kaa from the Jungle Book, and about how that snake had hypnotized a city of monkeys to walk into his jaws. Kaa's head moved slowly, deliberately to look at her. "Peaches doesn't give any favors," he explained. "Peaches takes them." Deborah didn't take her eyes off the gorillas, and though she was sure he thought it was because she refused to back down, in truth it was because she didn't want to meet Kaz. "Detective Perlman's got a hard-on for Peaches," she said. "Something about a whore stealing his wallet. I'm good at keeping him back, but I'm a busy woman." Deborah shifted her gaze to lock with Kaz. "Busy women don't have enough time to do a man's job for him." Ka didn't move at all. He studied her closely, but even his eyes didn't move. Beside him, the gorilla cracked his knuckles, and that was when Deborah knew she could take him. He was all looks. Ka saw in her eyes what she knew and licked his lips. "I'll see if he's got some time." "Who are you?" "Detective Samson," she said. "He calls me Debbie." When Peaches had bought the tenement, he knocked down most of the walls separating the rooms on the top floor and converted it into what he called Penthouse Gomorrah. When they went through the main entrance, Freddie froze. "Whoa," he said, and Deborah thought that was an accurate description. They may as well have entered hell. The squalor of the tenement's guts, the water stains, the soiled linoleum, the peeling paint, the dilapidated banisters, was sharply contrasted by lush carpet, plush furniture, and lavender lotus-printed wallpaper. To say that Peaches had a flair for the dramatic was an understatement. In the center of the room stood a huge hookah, easily 4 feet tall, and the dense dragon's breath of its sweet, humid smoke trapped the room's dull, low illumination. The glass at the base of the hookah was the same purple as the wallpaper, painted with luminescent yin-yangs. A coiled ring of black lights lit up the base. A long, fur-lined hose snaked its way from the smoking instrument to a man laid on a lavish triclinium. A woman rested between his legs and had his cock in her hand, a string of spit crossing the gap between the head and lower lip. Deborah knew that the girl had been brought in as a cruel joke. She stared the pimp down without flinching. "Hello, Peaches," she said, stiffening. Even in the weak light and tobacco fog, she could see the wicked little shark's grin that spread across Peach's face. It glinted in the faint light because it was steel. When he'd started, he'd had all of his teeth knocked out or pulled out by the friends when they'd caught him hustling on their turf. When he made it big, he had them replaced with metal fangs. "Hello, Debbie," Peaches said. "What brings you out to the border tonight?" He ran his long, thin fingers through the hair of the girl between his legs and pushed her head down. His face betrayed no pleasure. Freddy was overwhelmed by the grotesque display, and Deborah now wished she'd prepared him better. Everything about Peaches was meant to evoke a reaction, and it was through disturbance that he drew on his power. His mind was sharp and small as a fishing knife, and it operated an ego which had always wanted a larger vehicle for its propulsion. Peach's voice was airy, dancing on the end of a perfected lisp. His wiry limbs were clothed in a shimmering white kimono printed with explosive red poppies. His whole body was meticulously shaved of all hair, and his appetite for decadent grotesqueries was loud and public. Beside Deborah, Freddy shifted from foot to foot, his hands shoved into his pockets. Peaches' gaze languished over him, and then pleasure spread across his face with feline subtlety. He was already winning. The edge of Deborah's words were a little harder than they needed to be. "We're here to talk about one of your girls." Peaches grinned. "Cops are expensive, sweetie." His teeth clicked as he spoke. "I don't think you have enough for two, especially not with a girl." "She was murdered," Freddy interjected. "Cut to pieces and found in a dumpster. Maybe you remember?" There was so much hate in his voice that Deborah couldn't catch herself before she shot him a glance. If only Freddy were a dog, she could jerk back his leash. Peach's eyes stayed on him, snickering. The pimp brought the index finger of his free hand to tap his chin. I think I do remember. She was a new girl to the business. She thought she'd go through the meat grinder and come out empowered. He clucked his tongue and shook his head, moving the girl faster on his cock. Poor thing. She didn't even make it halfway through. The girl's nose buried into the flesh of his pelvis as he wrapped her hair around his hand and shoved her down lower. She gagged, writhed, and started to cry. She got stuck in the throat like a bad piece of meat. Deborah took her notepad out of her duster and flipped it open. Tell us about her. Peaches cocked his head to one side and then the other. He made a thoughtful, low sound in his throat as if he were considering it, and shook his head. No, I don't think I will. Of course not. That would have been too easy. I think you know about Detective Perlman. He's been lobbying the commissioner to lead an operation to bust your biggest spots. We can throw him off the scent. Perlman's a little boy with a big prick. I can handle little boys, and I can certainly handle big pricks. You're gonna have to do better, sweetie, Freddy said. Mr. Augustine, please, cutie, call me Peaches. Everybody calls me Peaches. Mr. Augustine, Freddy repeated, leaning into the words. It's hard to bust a man on prostitution, but it's not hard at all to bust him on dope. Peaches tilted his head again, this time in the opposite direction. His eyes glimmered in the dim light. What are you slinging these days? There's not enough Johns to keep things healthy. Detective Samson didn't say anything about Perlman busting you on prostitution. Detective Perlman wants you for the drugs. Longer sentence. Harder time. Deborah cocked her head. Can you handle that? Peaches studied Freddy, then released the girl between his legs, kicking her away. Mascara ran down her cheeks. She coughed and sputtered and gasped for air. No one dared approach her. Peaches swung his legs over the edge of the long couch, planting his bare feet on the floor. He was flaccid. Deborah leaned in even harder. You're big time in this part of town, but you've only got enough muscle to keep yourself safe here. We can bring you in for probable cause, Peaches. This place stinks like ammonia. That's got to be meth, and that's going to throw enough heat on you to give Perlman the momentum he needs to get a task force going. She shrugged. Freddie added, I'd give you a month after that. Deborah nodded. So, what were you saying about the girl in the dumpster? She tapped her notepad with a pen. Through her speech, Peaches sat more and more erect on the triclinium until, by the end of it, they were perpendicular. His fingers rested on the edge, tapping erratically against the shiny red latex. He raised his chin, his jaw clenching and unclenching, pulling the skin along his neck tight. She was new. I didn't know her except from breaking her in. I assumed she was a runaway. Runaways always talk about their families. You have a name? Freddie asked. Peaches cocked an abrasive smile. I don't keep encyclopedic knowledge on all my horrors. Lots of working girls are runaways, Peaches, Deborah said. She hadn't written anything down yet, and her pen tapped impatiently against the pad. That's not helpful. That's not enough to inspire me into compassion. You should read the Dalai Lama. He's full of wisdom on the subject. Freddie shook his head. We're wasting our time, Deb. Let's call in a bus. This asshole is driving me nuts. Deborah kept her gaze steady with Peaches's. She was reminded of wolves again. His eyes darted to the men by the door, and the floors creaked as they took a few steps forward. Don't even think about it. You think I came in here without telling anyone? Deborah asked. A glint reflected in Peach's eyes, as steely as his teeth. He'd found a foothold. You did once. I think it was even around this time of the year, too. Deborah reached in her pocket for nothing at all, brushing open her coat to reveal the holstered pistol. I'm not fucking around. I'm ready for a scrap if that's what you want. I don't know if you've picked this up, but I don't like you very much. We have a useful relationship, and I sometimes think you mistake that for something it's not. She stepped forward and the men by the door reciprocated, but Peaches held up a hand. Deborah got closer, her voice lowering. You're not a fighter, Peaches. You're a pogue. You sit on your dumb chair and get blowjobs and send real men out to fight, but I am a fighter. I've dealt with better shit stains than you. She gestured to Freddie. Detective Plum has too. We used to fantasize about how we'd fuck up that kind of armchair lieutenant if we got the chance. Deborah had unlocked something dark. It had been kept away in the cell beside the old ugly memories, but now it rattled its chains. This is shaping up to be one of those chances, Peaches. Peaches looked at Freddie. Freddie nodded. It is. I think I'm getting hard. Whatever dignity Peaches had tried to squeeze out of the situation, whatever face he was trying to save, had been an overplay of his hand. He had no more power, perceived or otherwise. He spat on the floor. Lucinda Love, he said. We know that already. What's her real name? I only know the girls by their whore's name. Deborah grit her teeth. You got an age? 19. That's what she said, at least. They usually lie about their age. It's not like you can cut her open and count the rings on her pussy. Deborah didn't react to the comment, though she wanted to send a boot into Peach's balls. Where'd she live? Peaches tutted and shook his head. No, fair's fair. I gave you what you came for. Threats only get you so far, Debbie. Honey, vinegar, flies, you know. Deborah exchanged a glance with Freddie. Though she refused to look at it, Peach's erection had returned, peeking out from between the halves of the kimono's white silk. All right. What do you need? I'll consider it. The friends are bringing in new girls. They learned from the ties, I suppose, and decided to expand their market to something fresher. So they've imported a large shipment of jade. Deborah snapped her notebook shut. You want me to impound it? The sharp metal fangs shimmered in the dim light, saliva reflecting off them like the sheen of stalactites. Yeah. Peaches jabbed at the girl on the floor with his foot and loosened the belt of his kimono. Tomorrow. Here 8, 1 a.m., the rest is up to you. Deborah pocketed her notebook. We'll see you later then. Peaches waved a hand and wiggled his fingers. The girl on the floor got up to her knees and opened his kimono. Deborah didn't watch the rest. She was in the car with her head pressed against the seat by the time Freddie got in. Her eyes were closed when he said, I didn't realize there was that much of a market for jade. Prostitutes, Freddie. Chinese prostitutes, human trafficking. Their friends are bringing in sex workers from China. Freddie's head went back and his mouth opened as he understood. And we're gonna bust it so Peaches doesn't have to worry about the competition. The fucked thing, Deborah began, turning on the olds, is that it's the right thing to do anyway. Freddie shrugged. That makes it easier, he admitted. It'll look good on our resume. Deborah pushed the olds onto the freeway and scowled. She didn't care about her fucking resume.
Deborah, December 8th, 2024. Ice sheathed the docks in a thin layer of white as gentle snow fell. Deborah held her coffee in both hands and took a sip. It was too cold. Freddie's jaw pulsed as he chewed gum, and Deborah was sick of the smacking sound. In the back of the van, a SWAT team sat drinking coffee and sweating underneath all the body armor. Their musk filled the van and nauseated Deborah. She kept the coffee cup close to her nose. Hardigan had jumped at the tip they'd gotten from Peaches. He shared Deborah's discomfort at doing the pimp's dirty work, but only briefly. We're saving those girls, he said. That's all that matters. Deborah couldn't disagree, but it still didn't sit right with her. She worked with Peaches, but had never felt like his errand boy. The bust set a precedent. Freddie checked his watch and drained his coffee. Almost showtime, he said, placing the empty cup in one of the holders between the seats, and then swiveled his head to her. You really think it's gonna go down? It'll happen, Deborah replied. Peaches is a lot of things, but he's not stupid. If a bust like this was a fraud, he knows we drop the hammer on his head and throw his body in the Pacific. And if it's a setup? Sergeant Hanks leaned his head between the seats. Then we got guns, he said. Big-ass guns. Freddie studied the officer until he went back, and then he watched the snow. Before them, the sea spread wide and endless, and the waves shifted chunks of ice back and forth. The weak light of the crescent moon appeared like bright, broken glass in the waves between the ice. The snow fell a little heavier. Far in the distance appeared a ship with almost no lights. Deborah almost missed it. She cocked her head over her shoulder and said, I think that's our boat, folks. All at once came the shuffling and clacking of assault rifles being readied. Sergeant Hanks radioed the other van full of SWAT. The ship slowed at the pier. An eerie silence blanketed the dark, broken only by the falling snow's tapping. The ship, an old thing stained with streaks of rust like old tears, pulled to the pier where a handful of men waited for it.
Deborah peered at them through binoculars and identified among the goons Eric Sams, a hustler and suspected hitman for the Friends. She smiled a little. This bust would make Hartigan very happy. The ship wasn't officially registered to dock, but with a little squeeze, Deborah managed to get a name from the dockmaster. The Kona made regular trips into the harbor, importing cheap knickknacks, primarily for online Chinese retailers. When Deborah threatened a conspiracy charge, the dockmaster was more than happy to confess that once a month, it came in the middle of the night, off the books, and he didn't ask any questions because some guy tossed him a roll of cash as fat as a Coke can. When asked when he was first approached, the dockmaster said it was 2 months ago. Beaches was behind on his game. The Kona stopped in front of the Friends on the pier, and Eric raised his arms wide like he wanted to give it a hug. The Kona lowered its docking plank, and a big round man with a big round beard shambled across it. He and Eric embraced, slapping each other's backs. Sergeant Hanks spoke into the walkie. "Go, go, go!" The door of the van exploded. Deborah and Freddie burst out with them, and from there it was all chaos and noise. The two SWAT teams shouted orders at the gangsters, and Deborah moved fast with her pistol raised. The goons reached for their guns on instinct, but SWAT rifles sputtered emphatic denials. Eric swung his heavy head left and right, but on the deserted pier there was nowhere to run. He shouted something that was swallowed by the pops of rifle fire, stomped his foot, and raised his hands over his head while he sunk slowly to his knees. The ship's captain ran across the plank and took a bullet in the leg halfway across. He fell, went over the rope guardrail, and splashed into the frigid ocean. Red and blue lights colored the docks as more policemen burst from seemingly nowhere. Deborah recited Eric's rights and snapped handcuffs around his wrists. Freddie dove into the water and hauled the fat, screaming captain of the Kona out of the ocean. All in all, it was a good bust. The Chinese women were escorted out of the ship and given blankets, along with Freddie. A team from ICE asked them questions while they took notes. They would be sent back, of course, but there would be a few weeks of decent food and warm beds until their statements were taken and everything was arranged. The law had been honored, but it still didn't sit right with Deborah. She still felt like a patsy.
Thank you for sharing my nightmares and helping me carry the grief. If you enjoyed the story, please share your favorite nightmare with a friend or family member, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. If you want to go deeper, ever wondered what your favorite story reveals about your psychology? I offer story shadow readings where I analyze what your chosen narrative says about your inner patterns and growth edges. I also do psychological tarot readings focused on shadow work and pattern recognition rather than predictions. Links to both services are in the description if you're curious about what insights might emerge. For ongoing support, you can find me on Patreon or buy my books on Amazon. I've linked to both in the description. You can connect with me on Instagram or Threads at Nightmares and Grief. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Good night,